Once again, welcome back. You are listening to a special edition of Street Soldiers Alive and Free Radio right here on 106 KMEL. This is a live town hall to address violence in the community with the goal of helping, trying to improve the relationship between police and our youth in particular. We're focusing on two cities in the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland. We've heard from officers in the respective departments. We just concluded a segment on Know Your Rights, and we're doing this all in the effort to make things better. Before I move to our next segment, I just want to acknowledge, in particular, the folks who. This is another group that's really involved in this. I want to say something about that. Today's discussion is supported by the San Francisco 49ers and the San Francisco Foundation. I know, remember last year, the 49ers really made headlines with a commitment to donate, actually they donated a bunch of money to foster communication and collaboration between law enforcement and communities they serve. Actually, they wanted to be here this evening, but things didn't work out. But they really wanted me, I really want to say that they are invested in this issue of police in the community, and I want to thank them very much. And this particular segment is going to focus on what if you have a complaint against a police officer. You didn't talk to me right, I don't know what you say, you cussed at me, whatever. You felt you was done wrong, as they used to say, by a police officer. What do you do? What recourse do you have? And joining us to discuss this and tell all of us what to do are Manny Forts, who is the acting director of the Department of Police Accountability. It's been renamed that. Before it was the Office of Citizen Complaints. He is in San Francisco. And Anthony Fennell, who I met for the first time tonight, who is the executive director of the Citizens Police Review Board in Oakland. And I can say these cities all differ with these things. And it'd be interesting. I don't even know if all cities have have organizations. In fact, they don't. I'm sure they don't have organizations like you that citizens can go to if they have a complaint against a police officer. So we'll start with Manny. And congratulations on your appointment, by the way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. I really want to thank you for including this and having these programs. You have been a hero of mine for many years for all of the things you do for this community, so please keep up the good work. We've known each other for a long time through the University of San Francisco, so thank you very much. At the Department of Police Accountability, we take complaints that any resident or any person has regarding the San Francisco Police Department. With those complaints, we will sit down, we will interview you, we will get that information, put it in a file. After that, we have a discussion about how we're going to investigate that complaint. That involves going to the San Francisco Police Department, getting documents such as the police report and other documents, talking to police officers. In San Francisco, we have the authority to have officers come down to our office and be interviewed. That is something that is mandatory, and so it's very unique to the city and county of San Francisco. From there, we meet with the investigator, the senior investigator, and also the deputy director, and we determine whether or not there is enough information to decide that an officer has done something inappropriate. Police officers must comply with the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. They also in San Francisco have to comply with the San Francisco Police Department General Orders and department bulletins and other regulations. It's very important. So what we do is we take facts from witnesses who are our complainants, and we analyze whether or not an officer has done his or her job according to the rules and the law and the Constitution. If we decide that evidence shows that an officer violated rules, laws, or Constitution, then we write up a report, we send it to the police department, we let and the chief has an obligation to review that report. If the chief agrees with the report from the Department of Police Accountability, then the chief will impose some level of discipline on the officer. In very serious cases, the Department of Police Accountability can go directly to the San Francisco Police Commission on which Dr. Marshall sits. So, you know, I personally, as an attorney with the Department of Police Accountability, I have prosecuted cases, serious cases, before the Police Commission. We do not, when I say prosecute, it's not criminal. It's employment law. Mm-hmm. So when a person, you know, if you have a job, if you're in a job and somebody misbehaves and you complain to the employer has an obligation to make sure that the person you complain about is doing their job. And that's exactly what we do. We go to the police department and let them know that our evidence shows that an officer is not doing his or her job the way they should. And that's the most important thing that we can do. And sometimes people do not understand entirely what the DPA, Department of Police Accountability, does, but that's what we do. So we try to ensure that officers act appropriately, treat people with respect, and if that's not the case, then we let the department know so the department can take corrective action. A police department is us. You know, it is not an occupying force. It is who we are as a community. It is part of us. The star, the badge that San Francisco police officers wear, that power to be an officer is conferred by the people, and it can be taken away by the people when an officer has proven that he or she doesn't deserve to wear that. And so that's why it's important for you to come to us. We have a website, Department of Police Accountability. You can file a complaint online. You can print a complaint and fill it out and bring it to us. We are located at 25 Van Ness Avenue, Suite 700. Come up anytime. We always have people who are there to take your complaint, to investigate your complaint, and I want you to know that we take this very, very seriously. It is important that the community understand and have an understanding that we do this job very, very seriously. Thank you.
Amen. Anthony, how does it work in Oakland? Similar or a little bit different?
Yes, very similar. In fact, the investigative process that my buddy Manny here explained is pretty much the same over in Oakland. We receive the complaints via email, fax, mail, walk-in, where a person can come right into our office. We have intake technicians on staff that will take your complaint right away, gather all the documentation, and then that complaint is assigned to an investigator. And that investigator is independent of the police department. We do not work for the police department. Mm-hmm. So the investigator gets all the information that the internal affairs investigators receive, and our investigators can go out into the community, gather new witnesses, gather new evidence, and in turn we'll present that to internal affairs as well, so they'll have the same access to it. But then we complete a report that's independent of what internal affairs does. So sometimes our reports align with the internal affairs findings. Other times, many times it doesn't.
Let's define what internal affairs is. Not everybody knows. If you're not into policing, tell them what internal affairs is.
Okay, the internal affairs division of the Oakland Police Department is a unit within the police department that where those officers and those supervisors take complaints from community members, from citizens, from people within the police department on officer behavior and misconduct. And those investigators within internal affairs conduct an investigation on that officer's actions. So it's an administrative process.
It's sort of police investigating police. This is the opposite of that, where you have citizens investigating the police. Just so. Yeah.
Yes. We conduct very similar investigations, only we're very independent of the police department. I answer to one person within the city of Oakland, and it's not the police chief. I answer to the city administrator. So we work alongside the Internal Affairs Division. But where we differ from Department of Police Accountability is that once that report is complete, myself and the investigator will sit down, we'll review that report. And oftentimes, based on that investigation alone, we can make a determination as to whether the allegations are true or not and what those findings may be. And we call that an administrative closure. We will render those findings and that decision, and then we present that to our civilian board of commissioners, which the best analogy would be you would look at it as maybe a jury, but they review all of our closures, all of our reports, and they make the final recommendation or the final findings on what the outcome is of that investigation. But if we need to have a hearing, say if it's a very serious incident, say if it involves several officers, several witnesses, and it's more complex, then we'll take that report and all of the evidence and provide that to each commissioner, and then the commissioners will hold a hearing. And it's much like a trial almost, where the officers are subpoenaed in and they come in with counsel, the complainant, the witnesses come in and they give statements, and they answer questions that are presented to them by members of the commission, the commissioners. And so once they've gone through that process and answered all their questions and reviewed all of the evidence, then the board commissioners will go back and deliberate, and then they will determine what the findings are for each allegation. Now, the last process for resolving a case is that I can take it directly to the city administrator. I can take that report and take the evidence, and I can make a determination, and I present it to the city administrator. And in all three cases, the administrative closure, the hearing, and a direct finding to the city administrator, they're all recommendations. The city administrator has the final say. And many times, the city administrator will look at our findings and look at the findings of internal affairs and may agree on those findings. And if we sustain, which is meaning that the officer committed the allegation and they are in violation of the policy or directive that goes with that allegation, so that's a sustained finding, then the city administrator will administer the discipline or tell the chief to administer the discipline and whatever that discipline may be. And it can be anywhere from counseling and training on up to termination. Sometimes the city administrator will not agree with our findings. She may look at our findings and look at the internal affairs findings and not agree with internal affairs findings and agree with ours. And sometimes she will agree in part with our findings and say she agrees that the officer did commit a violation and is sustained, then we would recommend a discipline. She may not agree with the discipline that's recommended. And in the past, I've had experience where the city administrator has actually increased the discipline that we recommended. So it's not always a disagreement where she lowers the discipline.
Right.
And oftentimes we can't talk about specific officer and specific discipline anyway, but the community doesn't get to know this because of certain laws, state laws, where we can't just disclose that information. But we have a good working relationship with the city and the internal affairs.
Two things as you're explaining this, and believe me, I'm not a lawyer, so when I got on the commission, I had to learn how much legalese was involved in this stuff, and it can drive you nuts. But that's what it is. There's a lot of legal stuff involved in this. But let me take it back to the beginning. What kind of complaints do you get from the citizens? I just like to hear, what are they saying? An officer did this to me, and I think something should be done. Just name some of the complaints.
Yes, we take complaints regarding everything, and it's really important if you have any type of complaint. So it's a range from when the officer stopped me, she was rude to me.
Rude to me.
Which was, that could be inappropriate. Or an officer stopped me on the street, didn't say anything to me, and asked me for my identification immediately.
So that does come up.
Yes, that does come up.
Okay.
The other thing that comes up is going into people's pockets. The officer just approached me, came from behind, told me to stand up against the wall, and went into my pockets. Or an officer at an accident scene, there were 3 cars, and the officer stopped me and interviewed me, but let the other person go, and the other person didn't look like me. So there may be issues of bias, and we investigate those as well. Anthony?
Well, yes, I like to call the particularly the rudeness and those type of complaints, which we get. That's the majority of our complaints. Call those demeanor-based complaints. A lot of times, the complainant or the citizen feels that the officer could have talked to them a certain way,
Right.
and or
Right.
the officer had an attitude, or something of that nature. We also get and investigate the more serious complaints of uses of force, and they go from the handcuffs were too tight to,
Yeah.
actual putting hands on, where the officer had to use physical force to tackle or use their taser. In Oakland, we have the officers are assigned tasers, and so we get those complaints sometimes that the force was unnecessary. Maybe that an officer pointed their gun at someone and the person felt like the gun shouldn't have been out or should not have been pointed at them. So that is a complaint. And then
Yeah, pulling the gun and just I can
Yeah.
imagine that would be
and in Oakland, as well as here, if an officer discharges their weapon and shoots someone, then we initiate an investigation, and we don't even initiate with a complaint at that point. I initiate those investigations simply to make sure that the officers followed all the proper procedures. So it's not pointing any fault or blame or any idea that the officer did anything wrong. We start an investigation from the beginning of officer-involved shootings to make sure that all the proper steps were followed.
Under the rudeness, and maybe this is do folks complain? Have you got complaints about officers swearing at them?
Yes.
Cussing them out or using words that they feel like you're not supposed to talk to me like that?
Oh yes, and we've had cases where, in investigating other types of complaints, other incidents, we've come across the body camera footage, and we view all body camera footage, by the way. And in watching that, we've caught an officer using profanity towards someone that they didn't even file a complaint on. And most of the time, those people are young people, because most adults will complain if an officer uses profanity towards them, but most of the young people don't, in my experience. And so we've caught that on tape, and we've initiated an allegation and an investigation into that on behalf of that young person.
And, in San Francisco, I totally agree with Chief Scott regarding the issue of how an officer engages a person. It's just very important to be civil. And when we receive those complaints that an officer is not polite or not civil, oftentimes those are the cases that you want to track to make sure that the contact or the officer's engagement doesn't get worse. So it's really important when you have an experience like that, and when it's just an officer who you believe is being rude, that we need to hear that, because we do look at officers and we look at their history or the history of the complaints, because what we want is we want officers to do things properly. We want them to do their job properly, and we're part of that process. So that's very important. There was a case that I looked at where the person had his cell phone camera out, and there were two individuals from the police department who engaged him and started using profanity toward him and calling him names. That's just inappropriate. You should not do that if you're a police officer. And that was brought to the attention of our office. We looked at the video. It was pretty clear. We brought that to the police department, and the police department agreed with us, and the officer got some time off. They were suspended from their job. Why? To make them think that this is inappropriate. Do your job properly. It's very, very important. The other thing I'll say is, one thing that is difficult for us, for my office and Anthony's, is that the laws regarding investigation of police officers is all confidential by state law. By state law,
that is true.
If an officer has a complaint against him or her and it's investigated, the investigating agency, the Department of Police Accountability, and with Anthony as well, we cannot publicize the officer's name or anything identifying the officer. So when you get a letter from the DPA that says the allegation was sustained or not sustained, sometimes you don't understand what that means. We're trying to give you as much information as possible, but understand that it's so important to come to us so that we can start tracking people to try to correct their behavior, to make them better officers, or just let them know maybe you should look for other employment that it's more compatible with your personality.
I know one of the things that you've used is what happened?
No, I wanted to add something.
Look, go for it.
And I know the focus is towards the youth and young people.
Yes.
And one thing I wanted to add is that tracking officer behavior, tracking contacts and complaints is very important. Even if, say, we can't sustain on your individual complaint, being able to track over a period of time, whether it's that officer, that unit, maybe it's officers that are under a specific supervisor, we can look and track all of those contacts and all of those allegations to see a pattern and then address the issue from that perspective. So as young people, a lot of times things happen to young people with their contacts with police and they don't tell anyone. They don't tell their parents. They don't report to anyone. They just kind of let it go and they complain about it.
That's true.
They may vent on social media, but they don't come to someone that can actually do something about it. And one of the things I try to stress in Oakland when I do community outreach and go talk to various groups is that I want you to file the complaint anyway. Mm-hmm. No matter how small or how large, let us determine if it's one that we can do a full investigation on. Maybe it's one that we could recommend mediation, bring that officer in and have them sit down with that citizen or that young person. Or maybe it's just something we can just document and look at on a broader scale. And I do meet regularly with the chief, and I do have regular contact with the Internal Affairs Office. And these are the things that we talk about is, okay, we have a pattern, and it may not be something that my office can do directly, but if we can gather this information and show that there's a pattern, then there's other resources within the police department that can then take over and begin to monitor that our officer, maybe bring that officer in. If it's a supervisor, maybe reassign that supervisor or do some additional training in those aspects. But if we don't know about it, if you just take the attitude that no one's going to do anything about it because we can't do
to your point,
specific.
You can't do anything about something you don't know about.
Correct.
Right. So, and you can't build a case. You can't track behaviors or even accusations if you don't know about it.
Correct.
And I think that's the point you're making, which is, and look, it's not that young people are guilty that I don't want to take the time. It won't do any good. It won't mean anything. But certainly nothing can be done if, in fact, you don't make the complaint. You mentioned mediation. Mm-hmm. And explain what mediation is, because a lot of times that is proven to be very effective, especially in some of these. I won't say they're not minor; they're all important. But when you actually get the officer in the room with the person and let that person have its say, how often do you do that, and how does that work with both of you?
Well, the Citizens Police Review Board has an ordinance that governs its rules and what we can do. And one of the resolution methods is mediation. Now, I've been the executive director there for 3 years, but the mediation program within the CPRB, which is our acronym, that it had just gone by the wayside. So we tried to revamp that. And we're in the process now. We have an agreement with a third-party agency, and we are now going through what's called a meet and confer process. It's just some other stuff you don't need to worry about, but we have to sort it out before we can roll it out. Yeah. And so the way it is set up is that we would use a third party entity, so we would not conduct the mediation.
Right.
The mediation is done not to point fingers at any one person. So the officer doesn't come into the mediation process with a finger pointed at them, no more than the citizen or the complainant has a finger pointed at them. It provides an opportunity, should the officer agree and the complainant agree to do this, that they can sit in the same room, talk about the incident, and both sides be heard. Yeah. So it allows, the benefit to the officer is, number one, they gain a better understanding of the people they serve. Okay, and they also, the citizen also gets an opportunity to be heard. and they get a better understanding of how an officer interacts.
Man, we got a couple minutes. You want to chime in on mediation? Because I
Sure.
know you do a lot of it over here.
In San Francisco, we have the national model for mediation in the country. We actually train other departments. Mediation is so important because it allows the person to sit down in the same room across the table from an officer to explain how the person was feeling and what was going on. And the officer does the same thing. So it creates a situation where people hopefully establish a bridge to see the other side, so that when the officer goes back out there and stops somebody, maybe that officer will remember, it's like, I shouldn't use this word or say this to somebody. And at the same time, it allows the citizen, it allows the resident to appreciate the work that officers do. They strap on a gun every day, and they leave their family, and they have to go and enforce the laws and protect people. And so sometimes, you have to appreciate that as well. But it's something that is very useful to sit down in the same room and understand the same side. But our mediation program is robust, and we would encourage people to come. It's actually a very, very good thing to do, to sit in the room and to talk instead of investigating a complaint. But that's where cases are eligible, and we make that determination. So
I know both of you have become sort of national models for this, and you do a lot of conferencing, you do a lot of stuff. I'm actually going
Yes.
to a conference up in, where is that, in Tacoma?
Spokane,
Oh, I know it's up
Washington.
north, right. And
Yeah.
we're going to be talking about the improvements in all of these areas.
Right.
I just want to thank both of you for, engaging in this work, and appreciate all the information tonight. When we come back, we're going to tell you what we're going to get everybody up here, and it's your turn to go at all of us, all right? You got your questions ready? You got your thoughts ready? All right, put us on blast. We'll be back.